At Sea Ranch, the sea was next to you, but there were no natural harbors. There was no way to use what the sea was except to just enjoy the world's largest picture window in some ways. And that was always the cliff of the design questions. Why not leave it the way it is?
Al Boki was the client. He had been an architect in Los Angeles, and he talked Castle and Cooke into buying some of California and developing and spending their money on that. So they bought 10 miles of the California coast from Stewart's Point to Gualala.
He said, I wanted to do something in architecture that was more than individual buildings. I wanted to have to do with being able to make whole places. The kinds of materials we used are rooted in wanting the larger landscape to be the dominant influence. And we wanted things to weather and for houses to become part of the landscape. And so Al hired Larry Halprin.
Lawrence Halprin was a landscape architect. He'd studied in Harvard, and he was a New York boy. But he'd also spent all his summers on kibbutz. When he got a chance to do Sea Ranch, in his mind he was making a kibbutz, very fancy kibbutz.
He made sure that the architects that worked here understood the philosophy.
We wanted to make buildings that became part of the landscape rather than buildings that just sat on the landscape.
But it was very windy. It would just knock you over. The wind was so strong. So Larry built around what they now call hedge groves. So all along the way, there'll be a hedge grove of trees that will block the wind.
There are these kind of rifts in the land. If you go down and look at the bluffs from the beach, there are incredible places where they're ripped apart and you can see different layers of earth coming up and going together. That's what we were working with.
The original plan was that the houses were supposed to be very small, wooden, and close to the trees. They were supposed to leave the meadows big and empty and forever.
So to try to get the buildings at the Sea Ranch to relate more together as a community, they introduced this idea of having a major roof form consistent, much in the way maybe an Italian hillside town of 300 years ago might have been.
He wanted to avoid it looking like a subdivision. For example, houses could not become mansions. That was out. Buildings cannot be made out of stucco, have to be wood.
The initial construction done by the developer set the materials and the colors. Essentially, no color. Redwood goes gray in a salt environment. It is also a great benefit because sooner or later, the worst architecture is going to disappear in that environment.
My relationship to the Sea Ranch started with my being a partner in the firm Moore, Linden, Turnbull, Whitaker. We were the architects for the Condominium 1 of the 3 first buildings at the Sea Ranch, which were designed to set a standard for what buildings on the Sea Ranch could be. There weren't many people who had done condominiums at that point, and it was an exotic new thing. It was a marvelous new way of thinking about collective things. It was the individual and the collective together.
The Sea Ranch condominium was, of course, the object, right, of the Sea Ranch. There was something about the vernacular cladding, the contrast between the exterior and the interior that attracted me to it. And ultimately, for me, it led to coming to San Francisco in the summer of 1966 as an architecture student, just on that impulse that California seemed interesting because of the Sea Ranch.
The condominium has a large structure, like the slope of the land, but then has these bays and additions and cutouts that happen because of reaching for a view, or because the wind needs to be blocked, or something about the environment has informed that geometry. It's a big structure. We wanted it to be big, not to look like a barn, but to have the presence of a barn in relationship to the landscape. But then every one of the units is different. And you don't necessarily read it as unit by unit. But if you look, one has a courtyard coming out from it, one has a balcony up on the upper level, and then another one has a greenhouse. It's an interspersing of that big image of a whole, of a community, and the individuality of the people who make it up.
Architects are always fascinated with wishing that there was a way to do modular housing or more affordable housing. And so the idea of a kit of parts, which really was fundamental to the condominium, that it was a 20 by 20 space, each space had an ediculi.
All the while, the salespeople were still not very happy about condominium as a notion. The salespeople would get somebody who was coming to Sea Ranch to think about the place and would take them into the condominium and take them into the different units. And they'd get all excited, and then they'd say, but if you'd buy a piece of land, you could have anything you wanted.
The one exception, in my mind, most successful, other than Condo 1, were the clusters and the walk-ins. Obie did a superb job on the walk-in cabins.
They were the cheapest things you could buy on the Sea Ranch. We had a really strict budget. The target budget was $10,000 a cabin. I started out thinking of a square to be economical because a cube has the least amount of surface area, so we're going to have less material. It's going to be a more economical approach. So they're very much a cube with a truncated or sliced off form to create a sloping roof. Well, in the redwood forest, I really felt that it would feel most appropriate if there was a vertical aspect or extension to that. The top of the walk-ins is skylit, which works just wonderfully because when you look out horizontally, you're looking at a telephone pole factory almost. It just trunks. When you look up, it's greenery, and you don't even get much sky in the redwood forest, but that's where all the beauty is.
When the Sea Ranch was first started, I think everyone thought all the houses were going to be pretty modest and available to many people. Over time, it changed the scale and the experimental quality of some of the houses. That sort of shifted somewhat. And I think as you drive north on the ranch, you'll see that the houses get bigger. Some of the original diagram of the meadows and the hedgerows gets compromised, and suddenly you'll go, how'd that house get out there in the meadow? And the Sea Ranch became a much more conservative place over time. And so originally we would see way more condominium 1 iterations here and way few single family houses like we're sitting in if the original ideas had really held. But because sales fell off and the complications over the access to the coast and all that, the plan did get eroded.
Initially, I think there were no restrictions. It was desolate, and somehow they just bought it. Later, they had lots of troubles with restrictions because they wouldn't let people on their beaches.
The plan was always to have a park at the north end of the Sea Ranch in exchange for any public access through.
The original plan for Sea Ranch had something like 5,200 buildable lots, which would have made it the largest community on the coast. Between San Francisco, and Eureka. Super architects designed these great wood houses, and the idea was you didn't need a whole lot of policing because there wouldn't be public access. So all the access for 10 miles of coast was one small county park, and that struck Sonoma County coastal environmentalists as such an outrageous act that rallied support up and down the coast.
The state decided that through the Coastal Commission, there needed to be a change with respect to the entire coast. The purpose of which was to provide coastal access to the public, and they wanted the size of the project cut down. Eventually, the confrontations of the various parties infected the entire environment. It did become a more suburban development, but the end result has not been as negative as many people feared. The access points to the coast are from parking lots adjacent to the highway, and the coastal trail turned out to be very beneficial for the owners at the Sea Ranch. As I go back and look at various points in the history of the project, I think attitudinally, you are much closer to where Larry and Al wanted the project to be. It may not be quite the same in the built character, but in terms of the commitment to the ideals, I think the commitment's pretty strong.
The myth is that it fell apart, which turns out not to be entirely true. The myth is that it needs reaffirmation, which is true. And there will be people who will become the new active guardians and stewards of the landscape.
Utopia never is going to work. You'll have to get close to it, but you can't be upset that you didn't get there.